Hello everyone. Tonight's story takes us back to the year 1348, to a time when people believed that roses could protect them from the invisible air that swept across Europe. It's a tale of faith, beauty, and the fragile hope that blooms even in the darkest of seasons. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And please, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see how many of you are joining us from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a quiet fan for a bit of background hum, and let's begin our journey into the past. I was 23 years of age when the invisible air first came to our city, though I did not know it then. I worked in the physic garden of the Hospital of St. John, tending the beds of chamomile and fennel, learning the ways of roots and leaves from Brother Aldrich, who had studied under the physicians of Montpellier. The year was 1348, and spring had arrived with unusual warmth. The roses bloomed early that year, their petals thick and fragrant, climbing the stone walls of the hospital courtyard in cascades of crimson and white. Brother Aldrich was the first to speak of what was coming. He had received letters from the south, from Avignon, where the Holy Father resided. The letters spoke of a great silence that had begun in the east, travelling westward along the trade routes, through the ports of Genoa and Marseille. Cities were being emptied, the letters said. Entire households ceased their movements within a single turn of the sun. The physicians could not explain it, and the clergy could not pray it away. I remember the morning when Brother Aldrich showed me how to prepare rosewater. We stood in the still room, where bunches of lavender and rosemary hung from the rafters, their shadows dancing in the light from the narrow windows. He filled a great bronze vessel with petals plucked at dawn, when the dew still clung to them, and covered them with water drawn from the well. The vessel was set over a slow fire, and we watched as the steam rose, carrying with it the essence of the flowers. The ancients believed, Brother Aldrich said, his voice quiet in the dim room, that roses were a gift from the Virgin herself, born without thorns in the garden before the fall. They are pure. They cannot harbour what is impure. His hands, gnarled from years of grinding and mixing, moved with surprising gentleness as he strained the liquid through linen. The rose water gleamed pale pink in its flask, and the scent filled the still room with something that felt like protection. We did not know then what we would need protection from. The invisible air arrived in June, carried on the breath of merchants who had sailed from Bordeaux. The first to feel its touch was a wool merchant named Thomas Gifford, who lived in a fine house near the river. I was sent there with Brother Aldrich, carrying our leather bag of remedies. The morning was bright, and swallows darted through the air above the narrow streets. Women called to each other from windows, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the baker's quarter. Thomas Gifford lay upon his bed, his face grey as old parchment. The marks had appeared on his neck and beneath his arms, dark swellings that seemed to pulse with their own terrible life. His wife stood in the corner of the chamber, her hands pressed to her mouth. Brother Aldrich examined the merchant carefully, then straightened and turned to the wife. "Fetch me roses," he said. "All the roses you have in your garden. Bring them here, with their stems." The woman fled from the room, and I heard her footsteps clattering down the stairs. Brother Aldrich opened our bag and withdrew a flask of the rosewater we had prepared. He soaked a cloth in the liquid and pressed it to the merchant's forehead, then to his chest. The scent rose in the close air of the chamber, sweet and clean. For a moment I thought I saw the merchant's breathing ease. "Will it help him?" I asked. Brother Aldrich did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the marks beneath the merchant's jaw, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before. It was not doubt, precisely. It was recognition. The merchant's wife returned with an armful of roses, their stems still dripping water from where she had cut them. Red roses, white roses, pink roses barely opened. Brother Aldrich took them from her and began to arrange them around the merchant's bed, tucking the stems into the gaps between the mattress and the frame, placing blossoms on the pillow beside the dying man's head. The chamber became a bower of flowers, and the perfume was so strong it made my eyes water. "They will draw out the poison," Brother Aldrich said, though I could not tell if he was speaking to me, to the merchant's wife, or to himself. "The rose is incorruptible. What is corrupt cannot abide near it." We stayed until evening, changing the cloths soaked in rose water, burning dried petals in a brass censer so that the smoke would cleanse the air. The merchant slipped in and out of wakefulness, his lips moving in prayers we could not hear. When the shadows grew long and the light through the window turned golden, Brother Aldrich placed a single white rose in the merchant's hand and closed the fingers around the stem. Thomas Gifford's path came to its end before midnight. His wife sent word to the hospital at dawn. Brother Aldrich received the message in silence, then went to the physic garden and cut more roses. Within a week, 20 households in our quarter bore the marks. Within a fortnight, the number had grown beyond counting. The bells began to ring at all hours, not calling the faithful to prayer, but marking the passages of those whose time had been completed. The sound became constant, a bronze voice that never ceased, until finally the bell ringers themselves joined the silence, and the bells fell quiet. The city began to smell of roses. Every house that could afford them placed roses at their windows and doors. Roses were woven into wreaths and hung from door lintels. Rose petals were strewn across thresholds. The flower sellers could not keep pace with the demand. Women who had gardens stripped them bare, taking every bloom, every bud. The price of a single rose climbed until it equaled the cost of a chicken, then a sheep, then more than that. Those who had no gardens burned what they could purchase, dried petals, rose hips, the woody stems themselves, hoping the smoke would create a barrier the invisible air could not cross. The city became veiled in a haze of fragrant smoke that hung in the streets and alleys, mixing with the smoke from the quicklime that was spread in the burial grounds. I worked without rest. Brother Aldrich and I went from house to house carrying our bag of remedies that seemed to grow lighter with each visit. For what remedy could we truly offer? We brought rose water and rose oil. We made poultices of rose petals mixed with vinegar and other herbs. We burned roses in censers until our lungs ached from the smoke. We prayed. In the house of a mercer named William Atbour, I found his daughter sitting beside her mother's bed, weaving roses into a garland. The girl was perhaps 10 years of age, her fingers quick and deft despite the tears that ran down her cheeks. The mother had already grown cold, her features peaceful, a bouquet of white roses laid across her chest. She liked roses, the girl said, not looking up from her work. Every Sunday after Mass, she would cut roses and bring them to Our Lady's altar. She said the Virgin loves roses above all flowers because they are pure, like she is pure. The garland grew between her small hands, red and white blooms twined together with trailing ivy. If I make it beautiful enough, do you think Our Lady will remember? Do you think she will look after my mother? I could find no words. Brother Aldrich knelt beside the girl and helped her finish the garland. When it was complete, he placed it on the mother's head, crowning her with flowers. And would you too have believed that a rose could guard a soul? The Hospital of St. John became an island in a sea of silence. The wards filled until there was no space between the pallets, and still more came, carried by family members who themselves bore the marks and would soon need carrying. We worked in the garden, harvesting every flower that bloomed, but it was never enough. The roses we planted in spring now gave all they had, blooming and blooming again as though they understood what was asked of them. Brother Aldrich no longer spoke of the rose's incorruptibility. Instead, he moved through the wards like a shadow, pressing cloth soaked in rose water to fevered foreheads, placing petals on tongues too swollen to swallow. His face grew gaunt, the flesh drawing tight against the bones, but his hands remained steady. One evening, as we worked in the still room preparing more rose water, he told me of what he had seen in Avignon, years before, when he had studied there as a young man. There was a garden, he said, attached to the papal palace. It was filled with roses of every colour, some as white as milk, others as red as wine, and some that shifted between pink and gold as the light changed. The gardener told me they had been brought from Damascus, from Persia, from lands I cannot name. They said that in paradise before the thorns all roses grew without blemish, and their scent was the scent of grace itself. He poured water over the petals, his movements automatic after months of repetition. I believed then that roses were a kind of proof that beauty existed, that God had not abandoned his creation to formlessness and void. I thought that such beauty must have power, must have purpose beyond mere ornament. "And now?" I asked. He looked at me, and his eyes were impossibly weary. "Now I think that beauty is its own purpose. The rose does not cure, it does not drive back what comes on the invisible air, but it reminds us of what we are trying to preserve. It reminds us that we once believed the world could be lovely." The smoke from the brewing rose water coiled between us, pale and fragrant, and for a moment the still room seemed very far from the wards where the silence grew thicker with each passing day. You cannot imagine the smell of hope when it wilts. By autumn, the city had transformed. Streets that once rang with the cries of vendors and the rumble of carts now lay empty beneath the slanting rain. Doors stood open to houses where no one remained to close them. The great market square, where I had bought apples and cheese and leather shoes, was deserted, save for the crows that gathered there, dark shapes against the grey cobblestones. Those who survived moved like ghosts through the altered landscape. We had learned to recognise each other by signs, the slow nod of acknowledgement, the way we kept our distance, the bundles of dried herbs we carried pressed to our faces. Some wrapped cloth soaked in vinegar around their mouths and noses. Others carried pomanders stuffed with rose petals and cloves, holding them to their faces with every breath. The rose gardens had been stripped bare. Where once the hospital courtyard had blazed with colour, now only thorny stems remained, and even these were being cut and burned. People tore apart the bower of roses that climbed the south wall of the cathedral, taking every scrap of petal and leaf. The flower sellers' stalls stood empty, their owners having joined the great silence or fled the city entirely. I found roses in strange places, a single red bloom placed carefully on a doorstep, already wilting in the rain. A wreath of white roses hung on a gate that opened to an empty house, a trail of scattered petals leading from a threshold to the street, as though someone had tried to mark a path to safety and had failed. In October, Brother Aldrich himself took to his bed. The marks appeared on his neck while he slept, and by morning he could barely rise. I brought him to his own infirmary, to a pallet by the window where the light was good, and I did for him what he had done for so many others. I bathed his face with rose water. I placed fresh petals around his head. I burned roses in the censer until the smoke made my eyes stream. He bore it with patience, watching me with a clarity that was almost unbearable. When I had done all I could, he reached out and took my hand. His grip was weak, but his voice was steady. "Do not stop," he said. "Even when you know it does not work, do not stop. They need to believe that something is being done, that someone is trying. The rose may not cure the body, but it eases the spirit. That is not nothing." His path came to its end 3 days later, in the grey light before dawn. I placed a white rose in his hand and closed his fingers around the stem, just as I had seen him do for Thomas Gifford all those months before. Then I went to the physic garden, to the empty beds where the roses had grown, and I wept. The winter that followed was the strangest I have ever known. The invisible air seemed to retreat, not vanishing entirely, but loosening its grip. The silence that had hung over the city began to lift. Survivors emerged from their homes, blinking in the weak sunlight like creatures waking from a long sleep. We counted ourselves, and the counting was grim. Of every 3 people who had lived in the city, only 1 remained. The rose gardens began to recover. Throughout the winter, the stems that had been cut down to nothing sent forth new shoots, pale green against the dark earth. By spring, buds appeared, and then flowers, and the courtyard of the Hospital of St. John once again filled with the scent of roses. But they bloomed for fewer people now, and the silence between the petals seemed deeper than before. I remained at the hospital. There was no one else to tend the physic garden, and I knew Brother Aldrich's methods. I knew which herbs to harvest at dawn, which to dry in shade and which in sun. I knew how to prepare the rose water, how to distill the petals until their essence ran clear and strong. I taught these things to others who came after, young men and women who needed purpose in a world that had lost so much. And I continued to make rosewater, though I knew its limitations. I continued to place roses at bedsides, to burn petals for their cleansing smoke, to press drops of rose oil to the pulse points of those who suffered. Not because I believed it would cure them, that illusion had been taken from me, but because Brother Aldrich had been right. The gesture mattered, the attempt mattered. The beauty of the rose, even in the face of what could not be beautiful, mattered. Years passed. The city rebuilt itself slowly, like flesh growing over a wound. New people came to fill the empty houses. Children were born who would never know the world as it had been before the invisible heir arrived. The bells rang again for weddings and holy days, not only for passages into silence. The market square filled once more with vendors and buyers, with the noise and colour and chaos of life continuing. But I did not forget. None of us who survived forgot. I remember a woman named Marjorie, wife of a fuller, who came to the hospital in the second spring after the great mortality. She was not ill. She had come, she said, to plant roses. She brought with her a basket containing 3 small rose bushes, their roots wrapped in damp sacking. She knelt in the physic garden and dug holes for them with her bare hands, her face set with determination. My husband tried to save our children with roses, she told me as she worked. He filled their room with flowers. He made them drink rose water. He hung wreaths above their beds. She patted the earth around the first bush, then moved to dig the second hole. It did not help. They went to silence anyway, and then he followed them. I knelt beside her, helping her settle the second bush into the ground. "Then why plant roses now?" I asked. She looked at me, and her eyes were dry but infinitely sad. Because he believed, because they were the last thing he did for love, because when I smell roses I remember that we tried, that we did not surrender without struggle, that we loved each other enough to grasp at any hope, no matter how frail. She planted the third rose bush in silence, and I helped her water them from the well. The bushes were small and looked fragile in the dark earth, but I could see the new growth at their tips, the promise of leaves and eventually flowers. "What colour will they be?" I asked. "White," Marjorie said. "Pure white, like the ones my husband placed in our children's hands." Those rose bushes grew and flourished. Every year they bloomed, covering themselves in white flowers that glowed in the evening light. Other survivors came and planted roses too, until the physic garden expanded beyond its original walls, creeping along the hospital's foundations, climbing the stonework, transforming the place of healing into something that was also a memorial. I met a physician from Montpellier who came to study at our hospital. His name was Jean, and he had survived the great mortality in his own city. We walked together through the rose garden one summer evening, and he told me of the theories that had been proposed to explain what had occurred. Bad air rising from earthquakes, he said. Corrupted water. The malign influence of planetary alignments. Poisoned wells. God's wrath. "And what do you believe?" I asked. He paused beside a bush of red roses, their petals dark as wine in the fading light. "I believe we do not know. I believe that all our learning, all our philosophy, all our medical wisdom was insufficient. We were like children trying to hold back the sea with our hands." "And the roses?" I asked. "What of those?" Jean reached out and cupped one of the blooms in his palm, careful not to damage the delicate petals. The roses were prayer made visible. They were the human need to do something, anything, in the face of the incomprehensible. Did they cure? No. But did they matter? Yes. They reminded us of what we valued. They reminded us that we believed life should be beautiful, even when it was not. They reminded us that we had not given up. He released the flower and turned to me. "Your brother Aldrich understood something that many physicians do not. He understood that healing is not only about the body. It is about preserving the soul's capacity to hope, to believe, to reach towards light, even in the deepest darkness. The rose cannot cure plague, but it can cure despair, and despair, in its own way, is as deadly as any fever." The years continued to pass. I grew older. My hair turned grey, then white. My hands, which had once been smooth and quick, became gnarled like Brother Aldrich's had been. I trained others to work in the physic garden, to prepare the remedies, to understand the properties of herbs and flowers, but the roses remained my particular charge. I pruned them, fed them, protected them from frost and drought. I knew each bush as though it were a friend, and I continued to use roses in healing, though never again as Brother Aldrich and I had used them during the Great Mortality. I made rose water for washing wounds, for it was gentle and cleansing. I prepared rose oil for soothing burns and irritated skin. I taught that rose hip tea was good for winter ailments. These were small uses, practical uses, but they were honest. I no longer claimed that roses could do what they could not do. Sometimes people came to the hospital who remembered those days. They would see the roses and fall silent, their faces distant with memory. Some wept, some smiled. One old man told me that his mother had made him wear a garland of roses every day during the Great Mortality, convinced it would protect him. I hated it, he said. I was 12 years old and the other boys mocked me, but she insisted. She wove fresh flowers every morning, her hands shaking with fear, and placed it on my head like a crown. "Did you survive because of the roses?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "No," he said. "I survived because of fortune or grace or simple chance, but I survived with the memory of my mother's hands weaving flowers, and that memory has been worth preserving. It reminds me that I was loved." This, I came to understand, was the true gift of the roses. Not protection, not cure, but memory. The memory of trying, the memory of caring, the memory that even in the face of incomprehensible loss, humans reached for beauty and hoped it would be enough. In my 60th year, a young monk came to the hospital to study under me. His name was Peter, and he reminded me painfully of myself at the same age. Earnest, curious, convinced that knowledge could solve all problems. He asked me many questions about the properties of plants, about the preparation of medicines, about the treatment of various ailments. One day, as we worked together in the garden, he asked me about the Great Mortality. "Is it true," he said, "that people believed roses could cure it?" I straightened, feeling the familiar ache in my back. Around us the roses bloomed in profusion, red and white and pink, their scent heavy on the summer air. "Yes," I said, "we believed that, or we tried to believe it, or we acted as though we believed it, because the alternative was to do nothing at all." "But it did not work," Peter said. It was not a question. "No," I agreed. "It did not work." "Then why?" he asked, gesturing at the garden around us. "Do we still grow so many roses? Why do we still use them in our remedies, if they failed when they were most needed?" I considered this. A bee moved among the flowers near us, its body dusty with pollen. A breeze stirred the leaves of the apple tree at the garden's edge. From somewhere beyond the hospital walls came the sound of a church bell marking the hour. "Because," I said slowly, "they did not fail entirely. They failed to cure the body, yes, but they succeeded in something else, something I did not understand then but have come to understand now. They succeeded in keeping us human. They reminded us that we were capable of hope, of care, of reaching towards something beautiful, even when the world seemed to be ending. That is not a small thing." Peter frowned, thinking, "But hope without result, is that not mere delusion?" "Perhaps," I said, "but consider, if we had done nothing, if we had simply lain down and waited for the silence to take us, would that have been better? Would that have been more true? Or would it have been a different kind of death, a death of the spirit before the death of the flesh?" I bent and dead-headed a rose that had passed its prime, the petals falling into my palm like drops of crimson rain. Brother Aldrich taught me that healing is not always about victory. Sometimes it is about bearing witness, about standing beside suffering and saying, "I see you, I will not abandon you, I will bring you roses even though I know they cannot save you, because you deserve to be surrounded by beauty as you go." That is also healing in its way. Peter was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Will it come again? The invisible air?" "I do not know," I said. "Perhaps, perhaps not. But if it does, we will do what we did before. We will try. We will use all our knowledge, all our skill, all our prayer. And yes, we will bring roses. Not because they are a cure, but because they are a statement that we choose beauty over despair, hope over resignation, love over fear. The bee moved on to another flower. The bell ceased ringing. The afternoon light slanted golden through the leaves. "Come," I said to Peter, "let me show you how to prepare rosewater properly. Brother Aldrich's method. You must pick the petals at dawn, when the dew is still on them, and the fire must be gentle, no more than a whisper of flame. The water should take on the colour of the roses, just slightly, as though it has borrowed their essence. And the scent must be pure, nothing burned or bitter, only the true perfume of the flower." We worked together as the afternoon waned towards evening, and I taught Peter what I had been taught so many years before. The old knowledge passed from one set of hands to another, across the divide of the great mortality. The knowledge that was both practical and symbolic, both useful and something more than useful. That night, I could not sleep. I rose from my narrow bed in the monks' quarters and walked through the hospital to the physic garden. The night was clear, the moon nearly full, and the roses seemed to glow in the pale light. Their scent was softer at night, but still present, a reminder that beauty persisted even in darkness. I thought of all those who had come to their endings during the great mortality. Thomas Gifford with his white rose clutched in his hand, the mercer's wife crowned with flowers by her daughter, Brother Aldrich, who had believed in roses and then stopped believing, yet continued to use them anyway, the countless others whose names I never knew, who had scattered petals on their thresholds and burned blooms in their braziers and worn garlands around their necks, hoping the flowers would save them. They had not been saved, but they had been accompanied. They had not gone into silence alone or abandoned. They had gone surrounded by the symbols of everything humans held precious: beauty, purity, hope, love. And surely, I thought, surely that meant something. Surely that was worth the effort, even if the effort itself was futile. I knelt in the garden and placed my hand on the earth where Marjorie had planted her white rose bushes so many years before. The bushes had grown large and strong, their branches spreading wide. In the moonlight, I could see the pale shapes of the flowers, dozens of them, glowing like small moons themselves. "Thank you," I whispered. I was not sure to whom I was speaking, to the roses themselves, to Brother Aldrich's memory, to God, who had allowed such suffering yet also allowed such beauty. Perhaps to all of these, or none. It did not matter. The words needed to be said. I remained in the garden until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. As the first rays of sun touched the roses, the petals seemed to come alive with light, and the scent strengthened, rising on the warming air. I stood and stretched, feeling my old bones creak, and went to gather petals for the day's rosewater. The dew was heavy on them, just as it should be, just as Brother Aldrich had taught me. In my 65th year, in the last spring I would see, I planted a final rosebush in the physic garden. It was of a variety I had not grown before, with petals that shifted between pink and gold depending on the light, reminiscent of the roses Brother Aldrich had described from the papal gardens at Avignon. I dug the hole myself, though my back protested, and I settled the bush carefully into the earth. Peter helped me water it. "What will you call it?" he asked. "The Rose of Memory," I said. "For those who tried, for those who hoped, for those who brought beauty into the darkness, even when they knew it would not be enough." The bush took root and grew. It bloomed that very summer, covering itself in flowers that seemed to catch and hold the light. The scent was extraordinary, sweet but with a depth to it, a complexity that reminded me of the rose water Brother Aldrich had brewed on that distant day before the invisible air arrived, when we still believed in the power of purity to repel corruption. I did not live to see it bloom a second time. My own path came to its end in the winter that followed, quietly in my sleep. I was laid to rest in the hospital's burial ground, and Peter placed a white rose on my chest before they covered me with earth. Or so he told me he would do. I like to think he kept his word. But before I went, I did one final thing. I took a single bloom from the rose of memory, the pink and gold flower that reminded me of paradise before the thorns. I pressed it between the pages of the hospital's great book, the ledger where we recorded all the herbs and remedies we used. I placed it on the page where Brother Aldrich had written, in his careful hand, the recipe for rosewater. There it remains, I hope, a flower that once grew in a garden tended by those who tried to hold back the invisible air with beauty, a flower that failed to cure but succeeded in something else, in reminding us that we were capable of grace under pressure, of hope in the face of hopelessness, of love even when loving meant certain grief. The rose has darkened over the years, I imagine, turned brown and brittle, but if you were to lift it carefully and hold it to your nose, I believe you would still catch something of its scent, not the full perfume of the living flower, but a ghost of it, a memory. And would that not be enough? To be remembered not for victory but for the attempt, to be honoured not for success but for refusing to surrender entirely to despair, to leave behind the scent of roses, faint but enduring, as evidence that once in the darkest time we chose beauty? I believe it would be enough. I believe it must be enough. For what else do we have in the end but the memories of trying, the knowledge that when the world demanded we give up, we brought roses instead, that when silence threatened to take everything, we answered with fragrance, that when the invisible air came to steal our breath, we used what breath remained to say, "Here, take this flower. Let it remind you that you are not alone. Let it remind you that you are loved. Let it remind you that someone cared enough to pluck this bloom and place it in your hand, even though they knew, we all knew, that it would not be enough to save you. It would not be enough to save you, but perhaps it would be enough to accompany you, to go with you into the silence, a small beauty to light your way, to prove that you lived in a world where roses grew, where hands reached out to offer them, where hope persisted even in its own futility. The rose and the silence. They are twined together in my memory, inseparable now, the red petals falling into darkness, the white blooms glowing in the moonlight above the still forms of those whose journeys had ended, the pink and gold flowers catching the last rays of evening sun in a garden that had buried more than it healed, and the scent, always the scent, sweet and pure and impossibly fragile, the scent that filled the still room when Brother Aldrich and I prepared our remedies, the scent that rose from censers in sick rooms across the city, the scent that clung to our clothes and hair and hands, marking us as those who still tried, who still believed, who still brought roses to the dying because we could not bear to do nothing. That scent is with me still, here at the end of my own telling. It is the scent of hope and of failure, of beauty and of grief, of the human need to reach towards something lovely, even when all loveliness seems to be draining from the world. It is the scent of the rose pressed between the pages of memory, waiting to be discovered by those who come after, waiting to whisper its truth, that we were here, that we tried, that we brought flowers into the darkness, and that when the flowers failed, as we knew they must, we did not stop bringing them. For that is what it means to be human in the face of the incomprehensible, to continue the gesture even when the gesture is futile, to maintain the ritual even when the ritual has no power, to offer the rose even when the rose cannot cure, not because we are fools, but because we are faithful, faithful to the belief that beauty matters, that care matters, that the attempt matters, that the rose, for all its inability to drive back death, still has something to teach us about life. It teaches us to bloom, fully and without restraint, while we can. It teaches us to offer our petals freely, even knowing they will wilt. It teaches us to carry our thorns alongside our fragrance, acknowledging that pain and beauty are twined at the root. It teaches us that purity is possible, even if it is temporary, that grace can exist, even if it cannot endure. These are small teachings, perhaps, insufficient teachings in the face of the invisible air that took so many, but they are the teachings we have. They are what the rose gave us when we asked it for miracles and it gave us only itself, which was perhaps enough after all, not enough to stop the silence, but enough to prove that against the silence we sang, We did not sing loudly or victoriously or with any assurance of being heard, but we sang. We sang in the language of flowers, in the grammar of hope, in the syntax of stubborn human grace, and if the song failed to save us, still it was worth singing. If we needed to hear our own voices, we needed to know that we had not surrendered without trying. We needed to prove to ourselves and to whatever watches from beyond this world that we were capable, even in our terror, of reaching towards something other than terror. We reached towards beauty. We reached towards the rose, and the rose, in its silent way, reached back. This is what I remember, here at the end of remembering. This is what I tell you, across the gulf of years, from the time of the great mortality to whatever time you inhabit now. This is the witness I bear, that when the world was breaking, we brought roses, that when knowledge failed, we brought roses, that when prayer seemed to go unheard, we brought roses, that when hope itself seemed a kind of madness, still we brought roses, and that the roses, though they could not cure us, did not abandon us. They bloomed through the seasons of our suffering. They offered their perfume to both the living and those who went into silence. They stood as witnesses to our witness, proving that even in the midst of incomprehensible loss, the earth still knew how to make something beautiful. This is the memory I leave behind. This is the testimony of the rose. May it serve, for those who come after, as reminder that you are capable of grace, that when your own trials come, and they will come, for such is the nature of this world, you too can choose beauty over despair. You too can bring roses, whatever that means in your own time, to those who suffer. You too can make the gesture, however futile, that says, I see you, I stand with you, I offer you this small and insufficient beauty, because it is what I have to give. And perhaps in the offering, you will discover what I discovered, that the rose does not need to cure to be worth giving, that the attempt does not need to succeed to be worth making, that hope does not need to triumph to be worth maintaining, that we do not need to win to prove we are worth remembering. We need only to have tried. We need only to have brought roses into the darkness. We need only to have bloomed, however briefly, in the night that threatened to consume us all. This is my testament. This is my witness. This is what I learned in the time of the great mortality, when the invisible air swept through our world and the roses could not save us, but they accompanied us, and that, in the end, was their truest gift. The scent remains, faint now across the distance of years, pressed between the pages of memory like that single flower I placed in the hospital's great book. But if you were to open those pages, if you were to lift that dried and darkened bloom and hold it carefully to your face, I believe you would still catch something of what we believed, what we hoped, what we tried to preserve. You would smell the rose that bloomed in the time of silence, and you would know that we were here, that we did not go gentle into that darkness, that we brought flowers, that we loved enough to try, that we believed, despite everything, in the stubborn persistence of beauty, and that belief, however futile it proved, however insufficient to the task we set it, that belief was not nothing, it was everything we had to give, and so we gave it, petal by petal, bloom by bloom, until the invisible air had passed, and the survivors stood among the roses, breathing their perfume and remembering those who went into silence, remembering those who brought roses to accompany them. Remembering that once, in the darkest time, humanity chose to answer death with flowers, and the flowers, in their silent way, bore witness, as I bear witness now, as this memory bears witness, as the rose, pressed and preserved, continues to bear witness across the years. We were here, we tried, we brought roses, and though the roses could not save us, we would not have been ourselves without them, for we are the ones who, in the face of the incomprehensible, reach towards beauty. We are the ones who plant gardens even in winter. We are the ones who weave garlands for the dying and crown them with flowers. We are the ones who believe that grace matters, that care matters, that the attempt itself is sacred. We are the ones who know that the rose teaches truth, even in its failure, especially in its failure, for failure too can be beautiful. Failure too can bloom, and we, who failed to hold back the silence with our roses, nonetheless succeeded in something that no victory could have taught us. We succeeded in learning how to accompany each other through the darkness, with patience, with tenderness, with small gestures that cost us everything and achieved nothing, except the achievement of having been made. We learned to offer the rose knowing it would not be enough, and in that knowledge, in that acceptance, in that stubborn insistence on beauty despite its insufficiency, there perhaps was the true cure we sought. Not a cure for the body which went to its ending regardless, but a cure for the soul which learned through suffering that it could still reach towards light, that it could still create beauty in the midst of horror, that it could still love in the shadow of loss, that it could still hope even when hope seemed a kind of madness. The rose taught us this, the rose which we asked to be our saviour, and which could only be itself, fragrant and fragile, beautiful and brief, thorned and tender. A flower that blooms for a season and then fades, leaving behind only memory and scent. Like us, like all of us who lived through the great mortality and emerged, changed beyond recognition, into a world that would never again be what it was. We faded too. We joined the silence one by one as the years passed. But before we faded, we planted roses. We made rose water. We taught others what we had learned. We passed down the knowledge, the gestures, the rituals that had sustained us when nothing else could. And those who came after us planted roses too. They plant them still, I hope, in memory of what was lost, in honour of what was tried, in testament to the human need to answer darkness with blooming. And when you see those roses growing in some quiet garden, climbing some ancient wall, planted beside some hospital or monastery or home, when you catch their scent on the air and pause, just for a moment, to breathe it in. Remember this story. Remember the time when roses were medicine and prayer and hope and farewell all at once. Remember Brother Aldrich, who taught me to believe and then taught me to continue after belief had faltered. Remember Marjorie, who planted white roses in memory of her husband's futile love. Remember the mercer's daughter, weaving garlands for her mother's crowning. Remember all those who went into silence with roses in their hands, accompanied by beauty to the very end. And remember that you carry this same capacity within you, the capacity to bring roses into darkness, to offer beauty when beauty seems pointless, to maintain grace when grace seems futile, to love when love cannot save, to try when trying cannot succeed, to bloom when blooming will not last. For this is what it means to be human, not to triumph over death, none of us triumph over death, but to face death with flowers in our hands, to go into the silence bearing beauty, to leave behind, for those who come after, the memory of having tried. And the scent, always the scent of roses that bloomed in the time of the great mortality, faint now, distant, pressed between the pages of centuries, but enduring still, as this memory endures, as the rose endures, as we, in our small and insufficient way, endured, bearing witness to what was lost, bearing witness to what was preserved, bearing witness to the stubborn beauty that insists on blooming, even when the world insists on silence. This is what I remember. This is what I testify. This is the last gift of the rose. Not cure, but memory. Not salvation, but accompaniment. Not victory, but the courage to try. And that courage, flowering in the darkness like a rose at midnight, was enough to prove we were worth remembering. We were worth the flowers we brought each other. We were worth the beauty we insisted on maintaining. We were worth the hope we refused to abandon, even when hope could not save us, even when beauty could not cure us, even when the roses wilted and fell and were swept away. Still, we were worth it, and the roses knew this, and bore witness to it, and whisper it still to anyone who will pause and listen, in gardens that bloom where graves once lay, in perfumes that carry the memory of prayers, in petals that fall like blessings on the earth. The rose remembers what we were, what we tried to be, what we became in the trying, and that remembrance, pressed between the pages of time, is the truest medicine of all, for it heals not the body which must always come to its ending, but the soul which needs to know it was accompanied, that it was loved, that it mattered, that someone brought roses, and that the roses in their small and perfect way said, "What words could not? You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are surrounded by beauty as you go, and that beauty, though it cannot save you, proves you were worth saving. This is what I learned. This is what I remember. This is what the rose taught me. And this is what I leave behind, pressed between these pages for you who come after, the memory of roses in the time of silence, the scent of hope in the season of loss, the testimony that we tried, and the knowledge that trying was enough, for we bloomed. We bloomed in the darkness, and the blooming was its own truth, its own grace, its own small and sufficient miracle. May you too bring roses when your time comes. May you too bloom in your darkness. May you too discover that the gesture, however futile, is the point, that the rose, however brief, is worth growing, that the attempt, however insufficient, is worth making. For in the end we are not measured by our victories. We are measured by what we tried to preserve, and we tried to preserve beauty. We tried to preserve care. We tried to preserve the belief that grace could exist even in the midst of incomprehensible suffering. And perhaps we succeeded, not in holding back the silence, but in facing it with flowers, which is its own kind of triumph, its own kind of cure, its own kind of salvation, the rose and the silence, forever twined, forever witnessed, forever remembered, in the scent that lingers still, in the petals pressed in time, in the gardens that bloom where grief once reigned, in the hands that still reach out across the centuries to offer roses to those who suffer, and in this testimony, which I leave like a pressed flower between the pages of the years, we brought roses. They could not save us, but we would not have been ourselves without them, and that, in the end, is enough. That must be enough, for it is all we have, and it is everything we were.